Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
As English ships bore down on St. Augustine, the people of the town grabbed their valuables and fled.
They realized that they could not hold him off. They didn't have the weaponry, they didn't have the personnel to hold him off. And so the best thing you can do is try to save yourself. That's why most of the townspeople run.
He had 23 heavy ships, 19 auxiliary ships, 2,000 armed men. What did St. Augustine have? A couple of sloops and rowboats, and a handful of soldiers in the fort.
They were no match for Sir Francis Drake, the man known as the Dragon.
They called him El Drake, the Dragon. It's a play on his name. And they feared him. They thought he was in league with the devil.
Because he was this rampaging, fire-breathing, appalling monster of a man that they feared.
Only about 80 soldiers stayed at the fort to prepare for the onslaught.
The governor summons the 3 other royal officers in St. Augustine to his residence. And one of his real worries, one of his concerns was, what are we going to do with the treasury box?
The treasury box contained the yearly allocation from the King of Spain. Any gold and silver would undoubtedly be the pirates' main target.
Privateering is state-licensed piracy. The privateer has a piece of paper which says, I am commissioned by the government of this country to do this against the ships and property of this country.
The treasury box was moved to the fort.
So the money was left there, and the food and clothing was taken into the woods for hiding.
St. Augustine wasn't even in Drake's plans when he first sighted the fort. The town was hardly worth looting, but it did have strategic value now that the English were trying to establish a colony in Roanoke.
As soon as Drake saw that watchtower, realised St. Augustine was behind it, and realised that it was a threat to Roanoke, the writing was on the wall for it. Nobody was going to threaten Roanoke.
Drake had been harboring a personal vendetta against Spain ever since he was a young man. It happened in 1568. His fleet had just seized a Spanish island when a storm forced them to seek refuge in its port. They negotiated a ceasefire, but the Spaniards went back on their word and attacked. Drake's ship escaped, but the others did not.
That burned in the heart of Sir Francis Drake his entire life, that he was betrayed by the Spanish and that he saw all of his friends die.
He hated the Spanish with a passion from then on. It was personal.
Drake's fury with anyone who crossed him was legendary. It's said he even once ordered the beheading of his own friend.
Certainly there are examples of a fierce temper, particularly during his circumnavigation, where he insisted on the execution of a mutineer or a supposed mutineer.
Queen Elizabeth capitalized on that anger, turning Drake into her personal weapon against Spain.
Queen Elizabeth allowed him to do what he did best, which was plunder her enemies. This is politics. King Philip of Spain controlled most of the world.
England saw great advantage in attacking the Spanish Empire, which was incredibly wealthy, but also incredibly vulnerable. When the Anglo-Spanish War broke out in 1585, this is exactly what Elizabeth I set about doing, ordering Drake to set off on a pillaging mission across the Atlantic.
Which is how St. Augustine inadvertently became a pawn in that undeclared war between England and Spain. Drake and his men had been on their way home after looting several Spanish towns in the Caribbean when they spotted the fort. Drake knew that attacking Spain's first settlement in La Florida would deliver a crushing blow to King Philip and his legacy. Drake sent his men to scout the fort, but they didn't anticipate what was waiting for them.
Well, they're attacked. They killed some of his soldiers when they came on land on that island.
A map published 3 years later depicts Drake's version of what happened. It was drawn by an Italian cartographer, Battista Boazio, who accompanied Drake on the voyage.
It's the first map of any city in the U.S.
In the very back in the cornfield, there's a little murder taking place. And you have to look carefully. It's really in the cornfield, and here's a man down on the ground with his hands like this, and there's another man with his sword raised. And it's the killing of a captain, Anthony Powell, who was Drake's kinsman as well as his best captain.
Drake didn't really lose an assistant. He more lost a personal friend.
He will be avenged.
One of the accounts holds that that is what precipitated Drake's rage.
Drake then landed and despoiled the city of anything of value.
After 2 days, St. Augustine's garrison had completely run out of ammunition. A Spanish officer later described the attack in a letter to the king.
He said, "We fought valiantly under odds that almost had never been seen, and then they were forced to flee." And he said, "We had to flee with such speed that we didn't even have time to carry the treasury box." And the next morning, Drake's forces took over the garrison.
Drake and his men burned the entire town and the wooden fort. Everything went up in flames. Imagine what it was like for the community and the soldiers and the governor to behold what they saw when they emerged from the woods. It was a sight of smoking ruin.
I think we found the archaeological evidence for Drake's raid.
St. Augustine archaeologist Carl Halbert believes the city imploded, collapsing into a thick layer of ash.
We found a burned deposit that dates to the 16th century. And we're not talking just a little lens. We're talking about a lens about 2 inches thick of carbonaceous material. Within that carbonaceous material were just lots of broken pottery.
But the reason why Drake burned St. Augustine is still a matter of debate. According to the governor's official account, Drake made off with the entire hoard of silver and gold from the treasury box.
Or so the governor claimed. This was his story.
And that was Drake's story as well.
2 years after the Drake attack, a fascinating character, a guy by the name of Pablo Swan, who was a soldier in St. Augustine, he arrived in Seville and immediately sought an audience with the King of Spain, with Philip II. And he said that the 4 royal officials took their keys and opened the box, took all of the money, the gold and silver, out of it, and filled it with lead. He claims that the governor distributed the money amongst his cronies and their allies, and bought off some of the other Spaniards who knew the story.
Some believe that this was the real reason Drake burned down the town, that he became enraged when he found the treasury box empty.
Take this away from me!
But we may never know, because historians believe Drake would have never admitted he'd been tricked. The Boazio map, which Drake commissioned, greatly exaggerated his victory.
Drake wanted to brag. You know, here's what I did. And so if you look at the town that's portrayed there, the buildings that are shown there are things that probably would never existed in St. Augustine. But of course, the grander the town that you raid, the grander and greater your accomplishments.
In the meantime, Sir Francis Drake returned to England, to his opulent estate, a former monastery known as Buckland Abbey, not far from the port of Plymouth from which he sailed. It was here he fashioned himself a legend, entertaining the elite in a mansion furnished by his ill-gotten gains.
Drake sets himself up as a gentleman, which he hasn't been before, and makes himself into the iconic English hero of the 16th century.
Yes, the pin-up boy, so to speak. He was the man you wanted to have to dinner. You know, he was the man that if he came through your village, you took the kids out to see. And certainly he was accorded almost godlike status down in Plymouth.
His was the classic rags to riches story, a commoner who had earned the respect and favor of the Queen.
Try to picture a ruthless entrepreneur, a television personality, a gang boss, and sprinkle into that an occasional touch of revivalist preacher, and I think you can probably picture Francis Drake.
The collateral damage left in his wake was overlooked back home, largely because these acts of piracy had not only been sanctioned by the Queen, they had been funded by her as well. Documents in the National Archives at Kew, England, confirm the extent to which Queen Elizabeth backed Drake's raids.
Right here's the name, Francis Drake, and the Elizabeth Bonaventure, and the aid, and the sum £20,000. So the Queen was a stakeholder in this adventure.
She made a lot of money out of this. Just to give one example, during Drake's circumnavigation of the world, her share of the profits was £300,000. That was a huge amount of money.
So he was a hot property. You don't throw away men like that, do you?
The Queen not only didn't punish Drake for his misdeeds, she had him knighted.
It was unheard of to knight a commoner like Drake.
She makes him kneel and she gets the sword out and then she hands it to the French ambassador. And it's classic Elizabeth. She wants to do something grand, but she knows the King of Spain would then say, well, of course, he's your pirate. So she gets the French ambassador to do it.
So what she's saying to Spain is, look, I've got friends. If you don't like what I'm doing with Drake, well, let's go to war and see what happens.
The sacking of St. Augustine was barely a notch in Drake's belt in terms of monetary gain, but it was a huge strategic victory. Drake's attack caused the residents of another Spanish settlement about 220 miles to the north to fear that they would be next.
The people in Santa Elena were so afraid afterwards that what happened to St. Augustine could happen to them that they wanted out of there. They were exposed.
And so the decision was to consolidate in St. Augustine.
Some British historians say this was a pivotal moment when Spain began to lose its hold on La Florida.
Spain was forced to withdraw from all its more northerly settlements on the coast of Carolina. So no, Spain was never then a rival in what is now North America.
The refugees from Santa Elena were pouring into St. Augustine. It nearly crippled the town, which was already struggling to survive. A stunning new archaeological discovery buried under the streets of modern-day St. Augustine was recently unearthed when the city needed to lay underground utility lines on Charlotte Street. City archaeologist Carl Halbert and his team were called in to dig test holes before construction began, and what they found turned out to be one of the most significant discoveries made here in decades.
There's the arm bones. The bones themselves, and there's the pelvis right there. And there's the vertebra, the lumbar vertebra right there.
According to historical maps, these bones were buried inside the first parish church in America, known as Nuestra Señora de los Remedios. The church had been rebuilt after Drake burned everything to the ground. But the many natural disasters that followed took its toll on the population.
The feet would be pointing toward the altar, and the head would be pointing toward the doorway. And then at resurrection, the body would rise up and face the altar.
Hey, what's this?
Archaeologists have identified other burials farther away from the waterfront, but this one is believed to have been the floor of the church, where some of the oldest bones would have been buried.
It's just right. You think that could be floor? It's tabby. It's. Yep. I mean, it's right on top of the bone.
Los Remedios served as the parish church from 1572 to 1702.
I've been here in St. Augustine for 25 years. You know, during that 25 years, we've literally uncovered hundreds of thousands of pieces of trash, pottery, broken glass, nails, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pieces of animal bone. You know, these are the items that people used every day. What we have now are the actual people who use those items. These are the people who enabled the city to survive. Yeah, so this is it. Now, I guess the question is, what should we do? You know, I mean, we could remove them, but they're in such bad condition, we'd end up destroying them.
Ultimately, the decision was made to keep the bones buried and not disturb the final resting place of these early settlers.
I'm excited. I don't think I'll ever have this experience again. If I was to rank this on a scale of 1 to 10, this would be a 10.
Some of the bones buried on Charlotte Street could well date back to this period following Drake's raid. With his people barely able to survive, the governor of St. Augustine turned to a Timucuan tribe just outside of town for help. They were led by a chieftainess named Doña Maria, who was also a Catholic.
Among the Timucua people, there were many women chiefs, and some scholars think that the number of women chiefs may have become greater once Catholicism was introduced, because apparently, among the Timucua at least, the women were the most receptive to conversion.
So this is her signature. Doña Maria, Chief of Nombre de Dios. She says, I might not look Christian, but I've been Christian ever since I was a little girl.
Doña Maria was a member of the Timucuan noble class, whose mother had been converted by missionaries. Doña Maria provided enough corn to save the town from starvation.
And she received all kinds of honors and privileges from the Spanish crown. She was an ally. She was a loyal ally.
Back in Spain, King Philip was anxious to finally put an end to the English curse. Holed up in his bedroom above the altar at El Escorial, he hatched a plan to conquer England. Philip still held fast to his vision of bringing about the second coming of Christ, and Protestant England was standing in its way. In 1588, just 2 years after Drake's raid on St. Augustine, Philip sent his armada to claim England and return it to the Catholic Church. But the invincible armada was defeated, and one of the key leaders of the battle against Spain was none other than the Queen's pirate, Francis Drake.
This gave rise to a myth of English sea power, this idea that England was wedded to the sea in a way that no other nation in the world was.
Without Drake and the other Elizabethan seamen, England would have become a Spanish possession. The world would have been very different, America's world and England's world.
But in 1595, Drake finally met defeat, and it was largely due to a Spanish admiral named Gonzalo Mendez de Cancio. who would soon become a key figure in the future of St. Augustine.
He's my 12th grandfather on my father's side.
Javier Cancio Don Lebún Balvé is a direct descendant of the admiral.
He had a brilliant military career, almost novelesque. We know he crossed the Atlantic more than 10 times and shipwrecked twice, and he fought the French and English pirates.
In a chance clash on the high seas, Cancio and his men captured a ship which turned out to contain Drake's handwritten orders for an attack on Puerto Rico.
This is a list of instructions captured on Francis Drake's ship, the original from 1595.
The Spanish used the information to plan their defense. Cancio headed up the Spanish artillery.
He fired the shot that killed the legendary John Hawkins on November 22nd, 1595.
The man who Javier claims his ancestor killed was an infamous outlaw. He was also Drake's cousin and close comrade. Several hundred of Drake's men were also killed in the Battle of San Juan, and the cabin of Drake's flagship was hit by a cannonball. Drake survived, and his remaining fleet retreated off the coast of Panama. There, after 2 unsuccessful attempts to attack that territory, Drake fell ill to the fever. He died of dysentery and was buried at sea.
This heroic deed was very popular in Spain, and even the great poet Lope de Vega composed a poem based on this event.
Gonzalo Méndez de Cancio was now Spain's iconic hero. He had defeated his country's arch-enemy. The dragon was slain. Cancio was appointed governor of St. Augustine. But when Governor Cancio arrived in St. Augustine, he reported that the city was on the verge of ruin. 5 Spanish shipwrecks had recently occurred off the coast in short order, and St. Augustine had absorbed the survivors.
It really was probably like a refugee camp.
About 500 people in St. Augustine are castaways. And of course, with that many more mouths in town, there's a famine.
Famine, in a land that had always been barren and unproductive.
And one of the Jesuits in 1570, he said basically the East Coast is one long sand pile, the most miserable land ever discovered by man. St. Augustine couldn't grow enough food for itself, so they were always trying to tap the Indians for surplus.
Cancio knew their only salvation was to form an alliance with the Indians, but that would not be easy. As far back as the late 1400s, slave traders from Spain, Portugal, and England had been capturing Indians in Mexico and the Caribbean and selling them, causing a deep mistrust of Europeans.
Well, imagine what it must have been like for a native to see this huge example of European technology, this ship with its huge black hull, with its spread canvas, with various designs, possibly crosses on it and so forth. White, bearded men. That might have been enough to scare anybody. It would be like an alien spaceship coming down in your backyard. So naturally, they fought it off in these places.
They knew from being seafaring people, trading with others, these strange men with beards and who were always armed, that they did not come in peace. They came to enslave, they came to rob.
Our people know these people as kidnappers, enslavers, people who created great hardship for our people and changed our world as we know it.
When we talk about the word civilized, I can't help but smile because in many ways, indigenous people were far more civilized than the conquerors that forced their way into their lives.
The brutality of the Spanish Inquisition only served to fuel natives' fears of Europeans even more. The Inquisition was a ferocious reign of terror in which thousands of non-Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and Protestants were barbarically tortured and burned alive for their religious beliefs. Out of this period came the Black Legend, the belief that all Spaniards were ruthless murderers.
Panfilo de Narvaez came into Florida, marched north as far as Tallahassee, and there he made the mistake of seizing the food stores at the Appalachia encampment. And those natives gave him a 24-hour rain of arrows that made it impossible for him and his men to survive, and they had to go down to the coast, build rafts, and escape.
So I think it's unfair to describe the natives as hostile. They were simply protecting their territory against foreign invaders, and that's clearly what the Europeans were.
And while the explorers saw natives as savage, the Spanish seemed equally barbaric to the Indians.
On these expeditions, when they're hungry, they eat shoes, and they eat horses, and they eat saddles. And they eat each other.
And then you have Hernando de Soto, who was a moral monster in the way in which he treated Aboriginal peoples. And he maimed and killed his way north through Florida, cutting off Indians' ears and noses and sending them back saying, this will happen to everybody unless you give me and my men safe passage. What was left behind? Collapsed native societies all along the range of 9 American states as we know them today. 4,000 miles of travel. And for what?
But in 1542, King Carlos V issued new laws ordering that native people who lived in the Americas were to be treated humanely. So by the time St. Augustine was founded, enslaving natives was prohibited.
King Carlos V issued what were called the new laws, specifying that the native peoples possessed souls deserving of respect, just as white Spaniards did, saying that any abuse of the Indians would be punished by the king and his officers, and just laying it down that all natives had souls that were the equal of the souls of white persons.
There's a period right about now when there's a shift from conquest by the sword to conquest by the gospel, and the king now wants pacification.
If these people could show themselves that they were human and they would be respectful of their word, then that would determine if we went to war with them or if we considered them an ally.
By the late 1500s, nearly 2 centuries before their famous missions in California, the Spanish had already built a system of missions throughout La Florida. The friars often lived in isolation in remote areas, several days or weeks from St. Augustine.
Of course, they're preaching, but they're also helping with any number of other things that they could offer, perhaps how to raise certain crops, how to domesticate some animals, things of that nature.
The Franciscan friars embraced them as brothers and sisters.
The problem is that nobody told the Indians, and they're not always ready for a conquest of any kind.
If you're seeking people to convert them, there's still that superiority that my ways are better than your ways.
Instead of engaging in the types of spiritual diplomacy that Native people are used to, they're trying to sort of push them towards complete conversion.
So that's where the gifts come in.
The gifts were really important symbols of spiritual and political connections, to have networks, to have information, to have goods. These were things that helped leaders of Native communities become more powerful themselves.
You make alliances with Indians by doing what they do with each other, which is exchange gifts.
So by 1597, when newly appointed Gonzalo Mendez de Cancio saw that St. Augustine was struggling, he immediately began brokering native alliances with gifts.
You're going to say, yes, yes, we'll accept your king. But that's because the Spanish are accepting your chiefs. And so those chiefs are having their power strengthened.
But not all tribal leaders were willing to accept the Spanish. In Guale territory, in modern-day Georgia, resistance to these Christian missionaries had grown.
After a generation of people had been subjected to proselytization and conversion, some of the groups really became very hostile, particularly the Guale people.
The Guale uprising happened just 4 months after Governor Cancio arrived. It was allegedly started by the heir apparent to the paramount chief of Tolamato. He was known as Don Juanillo, or Little John.
Don Juanillo wanted to take a second wife. And the resident Franciscan friar at Tolamato said, I don't think so. You've been baptized, you're going to behave as a good Christian, and you'll be quite content with the one wife that you have.
The friar threatened him with preventing his rise to chief of the tribe when his father died, and that angered the young man just as much as being told he could only have one wife.
Don Juanillo did not appreciate this interference in his private affairs. So he ventured into the interior, gathered a force of infidels, the Spanish sources tell us, and he returned. And he ordered the friar decapitated. And then he put the severed head, he put the head on a pike and placed that at Tolomato's boat launch as a warning. Don't interfere in local affairs in Tolomato.
The war party then moved on to other Guale communities, and 5 more friars were attacked.
2 of the friars to be executed asked to celebrate Mass first.
Pater Noster,
And the executioner sat around on the floor while he celebrated Mass. And then when he finished, they killed him.
Governor Cancio was concerned that the unrest could spread. Although he lacked any hard evidence about who led the massacre, he blamed the incident on Juanillo's decision to take a second wife. He also blamed the friars who were killed.
It's a convenient story for him, so as he writes the letter, he concludes by saying, the friars deserved it. They were interfering in political matters, in matters over which they had no jurisdiction.
In fact, a new theory actually points to a different perpetrator. Witnesses claimed it wasn't Juanillo who led the war party. It was another Guale chief named Don Domingo, who then convinced the governor that Juanillo was to blame. Cancio asked him to bring Juanillo in to face trial, but instead, Don Domingo served up his own brand of justice.
When the battle ends, there on the ground deceased were Don Juanillo, the paramount chief Don Francisco, and every single male member of the ruling family of Tolomato. Gone. Tolomato was wiped off the map.
The death of the chief and all his heirs left Don Domingo the new successor. Some historians now believe that the uprising was nothing more than a takeover, and that Little John was framed.
That essentially the friars, when the hostilities began, kind of got in the way.
But several still believe the friars were killed for standing by their beliefs. And the Vatican is now considering sainthood for the 5 martyrs of Georgia.
These were apparently men of great Christian courage and peacefully went about the celebration of the highest form of religious worship they knew, the Mass, and then submitted themselves to the sword. And they were ready to give up their lives if necessary, and did so without fighting back.
Whatever the reason, there were no further challenges to the work of the missionaries, and peace was restored.
The atmosphere in the coastal islands was pacific. People went back to their ordinary tasks in life, the friars and the Indians together. and health was restored to the mission activity in the islands, and may even have profited.
And new missionaries arrived, continuing to spread the gospel unharmed.
One of the most famous of the Franciscan friars in the 16th and early 17th century was Francisco Pareja. He learned their language. Eventually, he wrote a grammar of the language, a dictionary of the language, and wrote out the prayers of the Catholic Church so that a typical Timucuan could read it. This is how the opening sentences of the Lord's Prayer sounded in Timucuan. Heka itamile numa, hiban tema, bisa milanema, abakwano le data habema, bolunu nanemima noho boni habe. It has a kind of musical charm to it, but this was the Timucuan language in sound, but written out in Spanish, consonants and vowels.
The Indians are using books, they're learning how to read and write, and this is a time when some children in great European cities don't even have books.
A recent study of Timucuan manuscripts have led to the realization that not only did these natives read Spanish, but they also wrote in their native tongue.
We have about 1,000 pages of Timucua. Timucua is the first indigenous written grammatical language in the United States.
Flagler College distinguished professor of religion Dr. Timothy Johnson has been working with other scholars to compare the Spanish and Timucua versions of 17th century religious writings.
And interestingly enough, sometimes the translations don't always match up. There's one story of a shepherdess where it's set in the mountains and reference to mountains is eliminated. Why? Because there's no mountains. The people can't relate. They rewrite the story in such a way, like any great storyteller, right? Like any great preacher or teacher redoes the story so it resonates with the audience.
Another example is from the Confessionario, a document written by Father Pareja to help friars decide whether someone had sinned in the eyes of the church.
There is a whole series of what are called superstitions in the Confessionario, and the priest is supposed to ask the Timucua, are you doing this, are you doing that? One, for example, says, do you take the antlers of the deer and praying, believe that you will then be able to catch another deer as part of this devil's ceremony? So that's the Spanish, but the Timucua leaves out every reference to the devil. So when the Timucua person puts it into Timucua, he or she drops the whole demon part of the text.
We understood the Creator the same way everyone understands the Creator, the breath giver. The conflict came amongst a lot of tribes when friars would try to define what the devil was.
You might have ideas of gods who are evil, gods who are good, but to wrap it all up into one and say that anything that has to do with spirits that are malevolent is the devil is a big, big jump.
This disagreeable spirit that has been identified as the devil could be that same spirit that have came into our village and protected us from a bear. You know, these are what they call good medicine.
It's believed these Timucuan books were written in the late 1500s. They were published in the early 1600s.
So we're talking about a level of literacy that simply up to this point in time has not really been recognized. Literacy among many of the indigenous peoples.
But while culture and education flourished at the missions in the outlying countryside, the town of St. Augustine was still struggling to survive. It seemed every time the town managed to rebuild, it fell to the mercy of another disaster. In early 1599, another fire ravaged the town, destroying 14 houses and the Franciscan friary. And then, just a few months later, a devastating hurricane struck.
Basically, the water came up, passed right over the city. It was enough to inundate the whole city.
They reported that the water was face-high in the streets.
One more raid, one more epidemic, one more hurricane, where it looked like the very survivability of St. Augustine was at stake.
Governor Mendez de Cancio realized that the settlers would always be vulnerable as long as they had to rely on others for food. He brought in new groups of Timucuan and Guale Indians from the north and used them to cultivate the savannas and make them arable.
It was swampland, a mosquito-infested area that couldn't grow much of anything. According to documents in the archives of the Indies, corn production increased more than 3 times what it had been in the entire decade before he arrived.
This is one of 2 wooden chests that survived the trip across the ocean with Governor Cancio when he sailed back to Spain, carrying maize seed from St. Augustine. Don Javier says it was Cancio who introduced corn to the northern part of Spain. The corn from St. Augustine would become the first export from what later would become the United States. 1 year before Jamestown was founded, the settlement of St. Augustine had already made a major contribution to Spain's economy. In the nearly half-century that this colony had been in existence, it had finally become a viable city, with many of the amenities of life back in Europe. It had established the first parish school and the first indigent hospital in what is now America. But by the early 1600s, Spain began to wonder if St. Augustine was worth keeping.
The history of St. Augustine almost came to an end.
King Philip II had died, and his son had taken over.
The Spanish Empire radically changed from Philip II to Philip III, who wasn't a powerful king and didn't rule the empire in the personal way Philip II did. Philip III handed the empire over to the bureaucrats, who questioned the convenience of keeping garrisons like in St. Augustine.
Governor Mendez de Cancio and the missionaries pleaded that they had come too far to leave everything behind. The king deliberated for more than a year and finally agreed to keep St. Augustine as a Spanish colony. But by then it was 1608, a whole year after the English had brazenly staked a claim in Spanish territory at Jamestown.
By the time it came into being, St. Augustine was up for urban renewal.
The king's unwillingness to stop English encroachment would turn out to be a grave error. Unlike his father, who had routed out the French when they had violated Spanish sovereignty here 40 years earlier, Philip III decided not to challenge the establishment of Jamestown. It was a decision that would ultimately affect the battle for Spain's supremacy in America.
King Philip III issued an edict that there was no more going up and down the coastline putting out fires. Concentrate on building up your own cities and defenses. And really, there never was any need to worry about Jamestown. It never had a military force. It was never a threat to Spanish Florida.
The Jamestown colony may not have posed much of a threat by itself, but England did.
Shortly after Jamestown, other settlements began. Spain could not put out all of those fires.
For the next 50 years, Spain turned its energies largely to Latin America and the western part of what's now the United States. That allowed England to gain a foothold in the U.S. from Massachusetts to the Carolinas. By the mid-1600s, the vulnerability of the only Spanish settlement left on the East Coast was about to become tragically apparent. It was May 29th, 1668. a French physician named Pierre Piquet, who had recently been forced to leave St. Augustine in shame, was on a ship headed to Havana. He was about to get his revenge.
And he and the governor have become very acrimonious towards each other.
St. Augustine was now under the leadership of Governor Francisco de la Guerra y de la Vega, a reputed ladies' man.
The governor apparently has a number of women that he is spending time with inappropriately, according to the records.
Some of the governor's paramours had also shared confidences with Piquet.
Piquet ends up insulting the governor, and the governor publicly insults him, slaps him, which of course in the 1660s was a terrible breach of honor, and actually orders him to leave the town.
But before Piquet's ship reached Havana, it was captured at sea by a pirate ship led by the English sympathizer Robert Searles.
Now he is a nasty pirate. He'd probably shoot his own people.
Searles and his men boarded the ship and took its passengers captive. Piquet realized he had valuable information that could not only spare his life, but could also serve to retaliate against the governor. He asked for an audience with Searles. He told the pirates that a large quantity of silver bars had recently been recovered from the wreck of a treasure ship off the coast, and it was being held for safekeeping in St. Augustine.
And he's feeling vengeful. And so he gives Searles all the information he has about how the best way to get into St. Augustine, what the timing would be, when the guards might be on alert and when they wouldn't be. And so he helps them get into the town.
And you better not be lying.
Searles knew that no one at the fort would suspect that this Spanish supply ship had pirates on board.
And that was his Trojan horse. He came in on a different ship, not on a pirate ship, but on this treasury vessel, under disguise.
They attacked at midnight. People were asleep. They liked to catch them literally in their beds.
There was chaos in the streets as people tried to escape. Official reports describe what happened to one 18-year-old girl and her baby sister. Remarkable because women and children were usually left out of the documentary records.
One of the stories that probably grips us more than some of the others is the young girl, Estefania de Cigarroa, who runs out of her house and is carrying her sister with her. And one of the pirates shoots, and the ball from his gun kills the child in her arms and actually lodges into Estefania's chest.
Estefania survived. When the carnage ended, Searles' men had killed over 60 people, and they'd taken about 70 men, women, and children as hostages. The governor managed to negotiate a trade with Searles, giving the pirates wood and water in exchange for the release of the hostages. But Searles didn't release everyone. He kept the natives and Africans as his spoils, then headed to the Caribbean to sell them as slaves. When Spain heard of this, the crown realized it could no longer risk losing La Florida to foreign invaders and outlaws.
It pushed the Spanish crown into appropriating more money to build a new fort.
And that's why the Castillo de San Marcos was built.
It had now been more than a century since St. Augustine was founded. During that time, its residents had built 9 wooden forts. None of them had lasted. But a unique kind of stone had begun to be quarried on Anastasia Island, known as coquina. It was made of tiny shell fragments that had been compressed and fused together over centuries on the ocean floor. It wouldn't burn, it wouldn't rot, and it appeared to be impervious to gunfire. The structure is now the oldest masonry stone fort remaining in the U.S.
It was a major turning point in the history of the Southeast, because this building of Castillo de San Marcos, this strong fortress, really scares off, I think, a lot of attempts.
They were about to find out whether this new fortress would hold. In 1702, English colonists from South Carolina launched their first attack on Spanish Florida, as English troops marched through the Florida countryside, destroying Spanish missions along the way. The entire town of St. Augustine took shelter inside the castillo.
On November 10th, 1702, the gate is shut. And the 1,500 people are in there, and they don't know for how long.
There was no way to know whether this new fort could actually hold off the British, whether they had enough supplies to outlast the siege, or whether they'd be taken captive or killed at the end of it all. All they could do was wait.